So there's a very concrete answer, which is that there actually is a section in Feral Atlas on the coronavirus. And it's a series of entries that are sort of paired with each other as companion entries. There's one written by a historian, there's one written by an ecologist, a couple actually written by, one by a developmental biologist. And we were just delivering the project to the publisher when the pandemic started, and then when it started to become apparent that it wasn't just a blip, that it was actually going to be a world-changing event. And one of the things so we reached out somewhat late in the game to the authors of those entries to ask if they would contribute, because it felt like not touching on that in Feral Atlas at this particular moment would leave a huge hole in it. But it was also a moment when things felt so indeterminate. Let's say April, May, June, that one of our hesitancies about touching on it at all was feeling like we didn't know which way things were going to go. So I think there's actually something in reading those entries next to each other that is quite useful. I find intellectually useful, of sort of going back to that moment of indeterminacy and thinking about all of those possible narratives that were emerging at that point in time. I guess I won't try to track all of them, but thinking about, because right now, particularly after the election in the U.S., there's a sense that I get in the communities that I listen to of like just exhaustion and entrenchment, and people have been shouting the same things at each other over and over, and nobody feels like they've been heard. So I think there is utility maybe in going back to that and remembering a little bit of that sense of possibility. The other thing that's just a sort of broader thing, and is maybe a piece that's more about my own intellectual trajectory. One of the things that has been most interesting for me and most challenging about working on this project is working with mediums that I'm not familiar with. So, the digital architecture of the site, but also the visual and film media. Sound is a little more accessible to me, but my home form of expression is text and words, and I think that's true for a lot of people who succeed in higher education. True to an extent that often there may be a little bit of an encouragement or a blind eye that we turn on ourselves to just dismissing those forms of production as just entertainment and not like having intellectual heft. And I think one of the things that was really striking to me as we were putting the project together was that I would sit in a room with the editorial team, and we'd talk about images all day long, and I would leave the room at the end of the day as exhausted as if I had been listening to a foreign language that I had only like beginner intermediate competency in. It was so hard for me to think with images that it just, it was eye-opening, because I think what that forced me to do, probably for the first time since I was somewhere in grade school, was to sit down and really look at what the person who had captured a photo or the person who had made a drawing was trying to communicate, and what technique they used, what sort of textures they were bringing to an argument, and the way that image formed an argument that was perhaps just as canny and just as nuanced as the argument that I would try to make in text. And I think for me moving forward, part of what that inspires me to think about is, and this is maybe more as an educator than as an individual, because I have zero artistic talent, but to think about how to create spaces, whether they're formal classrooms or other spaces, where those kinds of expression are actively brought into dialogue with the more sort of traditional academic or science approaches to understanding environmental issues. I learned so much from it personally, and I think it also sometimes just makes me stop and think, okay, if somebody's telling me something is deeply important to them through this production of art or production of music, I need to stop and listen to the fact that they're saying this is important, not just tick off the box like this person says yes, this person says no. I need to stop and think about, like, what's the broader meaning of it? Like, where does that fit into a social structure, an economic structure, an educational structure, and what does that tell me about how we can move forward? So that's a long-winded way of saying, answering the question that you posed, but
I think it's
that's my takeaway.
excellent. I would actually like to just re-summarize a little bit, or like translate it in a slightly different way.
Please,
So
yeah.
as opposed to the, so okay, so we're in a social and ecological and political points of crises intersecting. A desire to return to normalcy also articulates itself for a desire for stability in a world that seems increasingly uncertain, increasingly unstable, increasingly insecure. So it's not just normalcy; it's trying to achieve some sort of security, or perhaps even certainty. And the idea of having to the idea of creating some other paradigmatic way of living together in this world is very indeterminate, and there's fear attached to that. And so I really appreciated how you handled that question by talking about indeterminacy, because I think it's important and something that has to be grappled with pedagogically. But then as you link it to aesthetic production, I feel like you're gesturing toward collaborative knowledge production practices that have to take into consideration people's different points of expression, creativity, affective, the kinds of contributions that people can make to interpret the world, but also those processes, new processes of world making that might be able to emerge out of that. So I think it, or at least that's how I would maybe translate what you said. And
I think that's spot on. I think that's spot on.
Yeah.
And one of the concrete places that takes me to is thinking about, what does it mean that most university students, I think, I hope, have smartphones, and are engaging in Twitter and Instagram, and there are all these capacities for multimedia production that we carry in our pockets these days. So that's, in a post-feral atlas world, that's part of where I've been going in terms of my thinking about teaching, that asking people to engage with socio-environmental issues, not just as like consumers of the information, but also as producers of media, is maybe one way to open up new creative conversations. Certainly not a panacea.